Hey everyone. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's 7:05. I think it's a good time to get going. I think we have some more folks registered, so hopefully they can join us. I did mention before, but if you did not hear or were not in the room yet, just an FYI, this session is being recorded. The recording has already begun, so this is being recorded, and hopefully for those who miss anything, we'll have a record of this for later on to review. I also just want to note, if you have any questions or comments as we go through the session, or if you're having any technical difficulty, feel free to message in the chat and we can hopefully take care of any issues that come up. So I just want to introduce myself. My name is Kevin Kane. I'm the Director of Planning and Sustainability for the city. I've been with the city since 2014. I'm joined by my Deputy Commissioner, Carol Sammel, and our sustainability coordinator, Nick Soufis, is here with us as well this evening. But perhaps more importantly, we have our consulting team that is working with us on this project with us tonight, and they're kind of going to be running the show and presenting most of the information. And that includes Stantec, which is the leading firm on this project. Stantec is a firm that the city's worked with on a number of different projects over the years, and we're very excited to be working with them on this. They certainly have a lot of experience in this area. And Stantec has brought on public works partners who are helping us with the outreach component of this project as well. So the reason we are here tonight is to share some information about this project. We're referring to it as Climate Ready NR. It started out technically being called the Climate Vulnerability Assessment. And so we're going to share some information about what it is and share some preliminary findings. But before we get into the real meat and potatoes of this evening's agenda, I want to take a moment to recognize Councilmember Sarah Kay and offer her the opportunity to share a couple opening remarks. So, Sarah.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. So, all over the world and right here in New Rochelle, we're already experiencing the impacts from climate change with extreme heat, increased flooding, record-setting rainfall, decreased air quality, more frequent and severe storms, and our existing infrastructure and coping strategies just aren't keeping pace. Now, New Rochelle's long been a leader on climate action. The city was one of the first participants in Westchester Power, a community choice aggregation program. We have Greener, an award-winning sustainability plan that right now is undergoing a comprehensive refresh. And New Rochelle recently became the highest ranking city in the state's Clean Energy Communities program. But we know there is so much more we must do to reach our climate goals and create a healthier and more equitable city, because climate change does not affect everyone in the same way. It's a risk multiplier. Black, brown, and low-income communities in our city experience the effects of climate change first and worst. In 2021, New Rochelle was the first city in Westchester to declare a climate emergency. The resolution recognizes the inequalities caused by climate change and outlines a course of action to ensure that no one is excluded from the benefits of a healthier and thriving environment. The Climate Ready Initiative is the first step in implementing those goals, and city staff and consultants are conducting an assessment of our climate vulnerabilities that are experienced in our community through data collection and surveys, because your lived experience matters. Tell us how climate hazards are impacting your life. This input will help to identify strengths and gaps in existing services so that we can create a plan that'll guide future actions and projects to address these challenges, with a special focus on our city's most vulnerable residents. We must recognize that to protect our community for future generations to come, the city must take action. And by building on the progress we've made and creating a cleaner, more resilient and equitable future, New Rochelle will continue to lead the way along with other forward-thinking cities around the world. So I just want to thank everyone who's on the Zoom tonight, and thank you to those of you who have already taken the survey and are helping us to spread the word. And thank you to city staff and our consultants who have put in so much work to get us to this point.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was excellent. If I can ask to just go back one slide, I just want to go through the agenda a little bit more. So we have our welcome, our introductions. We're going to talk about the objectives and components of this project. We're going to have some polls sprinkled throughout the evening to make it a little interactive and a little fun. I always find the polls during these to be fun. Then we're going to get into the heart with our presentation from our consultants. After the presentation, we'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up talking about our outreach, endeavors for this project, and wrap up with some notes for next steps. So next slide, please. So I'm not, we're going to get into this in a minute, but really, this climate vulnerability assessment is, we're looking at the negative impacts of climate change, and again, as Sarah mentioned, we're looking at the most vulnerable communities. We're looking at our most vulnerable populations. We're also looking at our vulnerable natural environment and our built environment as well. And this is broken out into a number of different components, which you're going to hear about tonight. And you can see them on the list here. So this is what our consultants are really working on right now, plugging away, getting a bunch of background data, doing all the analysis so that we can really have a plan that's based on some good solid data and research. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're going to do some polls. So we're going to kick off with a quick one to get an idea of everybody that's here tonight. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen. Feel free to fill it out. I will give everybody a few seconds to go through these. All right. Looks like more than half of you. Oh, it looks like we're almost there. It's strange for me being on the end, not being the one taking the poll. So almost everyone has participated. Looks like 100%, I believe. Okay. So let's see what we have. So looks like, not surprisingly, most of the folks here are homeowners in New Rochelle, so that's great. We have a few people who are renters. We have some employees of businesses and visitors, so it's skewed towards homeowners, but it's a good mix. And then let's see down here. Most people here, 85%, are familiar with climate change and its hazards. That's very good. I'm not surprised, and I'm very happy that all of you are here. I think as we work through this process, we'll definitely want to reach out to folks who are not as familiar, and we're going to be trying a number of different ways to get through that. And let's see, are you familiar with New Rochelle Sustainability Plan? Okay, so about 70% are familiar with our Green and R, and as Councilwoman Kay mentioned earlier, we're doing an update on that, so hopefully we can spread some more awareness of that. And let's see. So we have 62% have not taken the survey, so we'll talk about the survey more later. We'll talk about how you can access that, and we're also going to ask that you help us spread the word on the survey so we can get even more people to participate. So that's it for the poll. I'm going to hand it over to Nels Nelson in 1 second from Stantec. Before I do, I realize that we are also joined by Council Member Yadira Ramos-Herbert, who's here with us this evening. So I just want to recognize her presence and thank her for being here with us. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Nels to get into the presentation.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nels Nelson. I'm a senior planner with Stantec's Urban Places. I'm in our Boston office, and I'm very happy to be leading this presentation along with my co-project manager, Devyani, who is also on. We have a really great panel of experts. We have 5 experts who I'm going to introduce as we go along through this process that will each be talking about one of the different scope items in this very broad and in-depth report that we're building. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Norm, who is leading on our climate analysis.
Thanks, Nels. And hi, everyone. So I'll go quickly through some slides here. Some background on climate change and what we're focused here on, and then I'll get into some of the hazards that we're looking at. To begin, Earth's greenhouse effect is one of the main things that we're focused on when it comes to what is causing our additional warming and extra energy to be available in our atmosphere. So in general, the greenhouse effect is something that helps us. When we have additional greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it actually can cause additional warming to happen. Go to the next slide, Nels. There's some shared language of climate and resiliency that you may or may not be familiar with. In general, there are four main terms and four main ways that we describe climate and climate change. So climate change in general is known as the kind of various ways that the climate will change and its effects. So this can be things like warming, it can be changes in the intensity and frequency of heavy rainfall events. It can be the intensity of large-scale storms that impact us. When it comes to climate mitigation, this is where we start to think about actions to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, both at a local and a global scale. This can also be called things like climate action or greenhouse gas mitigation. When it comes to hazard mitigation, this is where we start to think about actions to reduce the impacts of hazards that might impact us. So we think about flood mitigation, or we think about challenges with smoke that we've seen in the past few years, ways to mitigate that hazard. And then we have adaptation. Adaptation is essentially where we focus on actions to prepare for types of climate changes that are already underway and those that are projected into the future. So sometimes adaptation is focused in even on hazards that we have not even had occur historically. You can go to the next slide. Some of the status for the Climate Ready NR here, the project is anticipated to last until November of 2023, and our survey is going to be open till the end of September, and we'll recap some of this later on. But in general, our data scoping process is underway, so we're going to go through tonight a little bit of the hazards, associated risks, and corresponding vulnerabilities. And here's our webinar here tonight. Go to the next slide. From the perspective of greenhouse gas concentrations and emissions, this is a look historically going back to kind of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and forward kind of till the most recent snapshot about 2019, 2020. On the pink line here, you can see essentially how much atmospheric CO2 is typically in the atmosphere. And historically, before we really had a lot of industrial boom, we were sitting in the 280 parts per million of CO2 and relatively stable in the atmosphere. When we go into the future here, we start to see on the blue line that once we started industrializing, we added more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the emissions, into the atmosphere, and essentially increasing GHG emissions are increasing GHG concentrations in the atmosphere. And we can see that as the lines really converge and go forward. If we were taking a snapshot now, it would be even higher than what we see here. Go to the next slide. When it comes to future climate modeling, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has put together a series of scenarios. What you're seeing here on the right-hand side in the figure is essentially the global average temperature change under different climate change scenarios. In general, there are three main scenarios that we focus in on. Tonight, I'm going to show you results from a couple of them, our kind of lower scenario, which would be our blue line here, and our higher scenario, which would be our red line. The significance of these are essentially that the blue scenario from a risk perspective is somewhere that is realistic for us to maybe get to if we are able to keep our temperature warming under about 2 degrees. And the red scenario is essentially the one that if we don't rein in emissions globally and we continue to emit at the same rate, our business as usual emission scenario, we get to a large amount of temperature change. The global temperature change in that perspective would be somewhere on the order of 4 degrees Celsius or 6 to 7 degrees of Fahrenheit of warming. Go to the next slide. Some of the main hazards that we start to see, and this is coming from the newest IPCC report, is that the global average warming since 1900 is about 1 degree Celsius. And our trends and extremes will continue as average global temperature increases. So some of these indicators that we see are things like extreme heat Globally, we're seeing this becoming hotter and more frequent. Extreme cold, we're seeing actually abate, and we're actually having warmer cold extremes, if that makes sense, and less frequent extreme cold. We have heavy precipitation events that are becoming more intense and more frequent. We have droughts that are drier and more frequent, and we have tropical storms and tropical cyclones that are more intense. When it comes to the ocean, we start to see things like marine heat waves that are warmer and more frequent. And then from the sea level rise perspective, we see extreme sea levels coupled with sea level rise, which are becoming more frequent as well. Go to the next slide. A couple of interesting ways to look at this too are projections. So we had kind of our RCP scenarios there. The one thing that we can think about is that we do have some policy targets globally that are pledges and targets to keep us to 2 degrees or less of warming. In order to get to some of those areas from where we are currently on GHG emissions, there's large amounts of action that are needed, and New Rochelle is providing some of those actions, at least at the local scale. But we're reliant on a global perspective to make sure those changes happen. By the 2030 targets in the purple line here, if we were only looking at targets that have been made for 2030, we would still see about 2.4 degrees Celsius of warming globally, which would lead to quite a bit more actually locally in specific locations. Go to the next slide. One other way of looking at this too is to kind of put a human perspective on this. The extent essentially to which current and future generations will experience hotter in a different world essentially depends on the choices that we're making now. This figure is pretty powerful. If anyone like myself, I have a son who was born in 2020. So when I see this figure and I think about my son as a 70-year-old, you start to see that the climate that they were born into, if we don't actually make our adaptation and mitigation targets happen, will be very, very different by the time they're 70 years old and exposed to much more heat. So this figure is really helpful to drive this home. And if you're interested, you can look at the IPCC 6th assessment synthesis report. Go to the next slide. This is an example of some of the billion-dollar disasters that have happened over time. Then now this is a national perspective. If we want to look at this locally, you can think about a series of events that have happened, even stretching back to 2007 with some nor'easter events that caused extreme flooding and winds. You can think back to 2012 with Hurricane Sandy, or some of the other events that have happened, like in 2021 with Hurricane Ida and the extreme flooding, and then a number of heat advisories. Even more recently, some of the Canadian wildfire smoke that caused major problems with air quality and air quality alerts. And then flooding events in July of 2023, where the Hudson Valley has set a record for flooding for non-hurricane events. So just to show that there's been a number of large-scale events, and our large extreme events are costing more and more money, essentially, for us to adapt to. You can go to the next slide. To bring this down to kind of more local scale, historically, you start to see that the maximum temperature for the region, this is just a map showing you the number of days on average historically, where you can expect 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So days per year that you would see this over a 30-year period on average. So you may have some years that are much higher or lower than this, but in general, across the region, about 1 day per year is about average. Sorry, I'm trying not to cough. Just making sure you can still hear me. So in this case here, we're looking at a high temperature risk map, and we're using this type of input to our other portions of the vulnerability assessment. You can go to the next slide, Nels. So some of these preliminary hazards and scoping findings that we've seen, you can go to the next slide. We looked at hazards from temperature, precipitation, coastal storms, sea level rise, air quality, water quality and algae blooms, and then potential invasive species. And all of these go into the furthest parts of this assessment. You can go to the next slide. In general, so I showed you very quickly what RCPs mean. So if you think about the 4.5 versus 8.5 here, so this is a moderate versus a high emission scenario. In general here, we can think about days with temperatures above 90 or days with temperatures above 95. In any event, on average, you have about, let's use the temperature above 95 example, you have about 1 day per year on average in the last 30 years. By the 2030s, under a high emission scenario, that becomes almost 6 days per year. And by the end of the century, under a high emission scenario, that becomes almost a month per year. For days above 90, that becomes almost 2 months per year, as opposed to a week per year. It's a large difference and a large magnitude of change and increased vulnerability. You can go to the next slide, Nels. Sorry, my voice is just giving out. So in general here, this is showing essentially the change in mean temperature seasonally. The largest changes that you start to see are in the autumn season, with about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit change and about 10.2 degrees change under either scenario. So under 4.5, you start to see about 4.5 degrees change, and under the highest emission scenario, you see about 10 degrees change from our current normal temperatures. You go to the next slide. In terms of average annual maximum precipitation, so this is an idea of like how many inches of rainfall would you expect to see on average over a 3 or 5 or 1 or 3 or 5 day period. So if we were to look at the 5 day period, historically your large events, are somewhere between 4 and 5 inches of rainfall. And one of the ways that climate change is changing the intensity and frequency of large rainfall events is by the end of the century, you start to see an increase in the amount of potential rainfall in a single event. So your average rainfall event becomes about 5.3 or 5.6 inches of rainfall for a 5 day event, as opposed to just 4.8 or 4.5. So you see about an inch of rainfall increase just from the fact that the temperature is warming overall. You can go to the next slide, Nils. In terms of seasonal precipitation, the pattern's not as easy to tease out as we see in temperature. However, we do see that overall a large change of, especially in the winter season, of up to 35% for both scenarios and 33.6%. So in general, we're seeing a larger change in our winter months than any of the other months. And that's as storms are increasing the amount of precipitation they can hold. You can go to the next slide, Nels. From a sea level rise perspective, you'll see a little bit more on this in a couple more slides. Sea levels are projected to rise in the New Rochelle region, mainly as a result of both thermal expansion due to the warming of the water and sea temperature water, and the loss of ice sheets and glacial loss globally. In general, Kings Point Station has shown that sea level is rising at a pace of about 0.85 feet per century, or about 2.6 millimeters per year, which is significantly higher than the global average. So most of the global scenarios would be different than what you see here. You can go to the next slide. From the perspective of coastal storms, a total of about 48 tropical and extratropical storms have made landfall within 60 miles of New Rochelle. So under a warming climate, we're seeing that increasing ocean temperatures in the northeast coast enhance the strength of tropical storms and cause severe flooding and structural damage in the region. And in general, extratropical storms such as nor'easters, small storms are expected to diminish in the number by the end of the century, but the most damaging events will still remain to be about the same under warming climate. So we may see fewer small storms, but still a large number of intense storms. Go to the next slide. From an air quality perspective, this is a significant risk to human health, and we probably have experienced more of this in the last few months than we would have ever expected, I think, in this year. As we get exposed to more fine particulate matter and air pollutants such as ozone and oxides and nitrogen and carbon monoxide. Under the impacts of climate change, air quality can worsen in the New Rochelle region, and we see the increased frequency and intensity of things like heat waves and heat domes, and also our, import of wildfire smoke that can cause a large impact on the urban heat island effect and worsen the effects of air pollution. You can go to the next slide. Also, potential invasive species are one of the concerns that we have here because they can have a negative impact both on the local environment, the economy, and on human health. So in general, things like invasive weeds have started to plague local parks under warming climate, and invasive vines can disturb the growth of local foliage and plants, and they represent a significant danger to the flora that's endemic to the region. And we can see things like invasive species like deer ticks and the expansion of vectors such as Lyme disease. Go to the next slide. And I think this might be my last one, water quality and algal blooms. Algal blooms have become a pressing issue in the recent years due to increasing water temperature and nitrogen in water bodies and lakes and rivers. For example, Pine Brook Lake has experienced severe algal blooms and green algae in the lake surface of 2011. And we've seen other ponds have higher than usual algal growth in recent seasons. So climate change has impacts from increasing precipitation, runoff patterns, and can impact water quality and negatively introduce unwanted nutrients that lead to more algal growth. So you can go to the next slide there, Nels. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Norm. That was really incredible. It's just fantastic to be able to hear the real climate science right from a climate scientist's mouth. And if you have questions for Norm, you can type those in the chat and we'll get them at the end. We're gonna do what we've done, which is take Norm's results and look at them from a few different perspectives. And we're gonna start with Lori looking at public health and vulnerable populations. Then we'll talk about community resources and natural resources, and finally, some ideas about resilient hubs. And so we're going to move through these parts a little bit quicker, just to give you an idea of how we're thinking about translating the results from Norm's work into action items. With that, I'll hand it over to Lori.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Norm, for such a great job. So can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. I just got a message. Expanding on what Nels just presented, we're just gonna look at a snippet, mostly due to time, of the impacts on health and also with a special focus on vulnerable populations. For this example, we're defining vulnerable populations as those who are most either have the most exposure or who are like highly sensitive to different impacts from climate change and climate risks, and who have a lower capacity to adapt to climate. This image is just kind of a broad overview of how it's very hard, if not impossible, to separate health and vulnerability from the other impacts. So like looking at built environment and looking at infrastructure or natural resources all interplay with health, and specifically on those communities that are more vulnerable. So looking at the left side, health and health systems interplay with heat-related illness. If you look at the top, there's different types of health-related impacts, looking at mental health and behavioral health, to asthma, chronic illness, different types of vector-borne disease and infections, looking at food-borne illnesses and water-borne illnesses. And it also includes different migration. So those communities who either are forced to migrate or choose to migrate because of climate-related hazards. If you can, and also I just want to mention one thing, that if you look this interplay, I will also be going into more detail towards the end of how these interact. If you can go to the next slide, that would be great. So before we go into some of the more exposures, we're just going to look at how climate impacts vulnerability, and specific, just a snippet again of the New Rochelle profile. Thank you. So when you look at the CDC has different definitions of what vulnerable populations are and who is kind of like falls under that umbrella. For here, we're just going to look at it and think about it in terms of individuals, communities with higher risk for disproportionate health impacts. That could be due to economic, cultural, racial, geographical, age-related, and those who have predisposed health and medical conditions. They can also include low income and low resource communities, different marginalized communities, those with access and functional needs, whether that's physical or emotional or different type of mental health challenges. And they also, here we're just looking at like a breakdown of women and children, seniors, persons with disabilities, and that includes the umbrella of both physical and mental challenges, and looking at the difference between racial and ethnic diversity. Because of time, I'm not going to go into all of these, but I will emphasize a couple. So when we look at children, Norm, I was that slide that you had on looking at the projection on, and we think about children who are either born now or who are younger, children do not have the physiology and metabolism to really process some of the different climate impacts, and they are more susceptible to both air and food challenges. They are also don't necessarily have the body weight to take different heat-related challenges, and they often experience adverse effects due to either a single or the compounding impacts of climate change. And in New Rochelle, one of the most recent estimates from the census is that there were 23.9% of households with children of under 18, which is a large percentage of looking into the future of New Rochelle's population. On the other end of the spectrum, we look at seniors, and they also, seniors have a greater likelihood of having pre-existing illnesses that might make them more susceptible to either air quality changes or heat stress, as well as extreme cold and some of the other challenges that the heat threats that Norm was referring to. And it's estimated that 17.5% of New Rochelle's population is 65 years and older, which again is a significant portion. And that, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip that data point. When we look at people who are living in living in poverty or socioeconomic stress, a lot of the challenges come with compounding impacts, whether they have access to transportation, if there is a climate event related event, or access to healthcare. And we look at some of those compounding events in this next slide, but it's important to just note that 55% of New Rochelle spent a significant amount of their income on rent, which leaves very little to be able to mitigate some of the other known or unknown or unexpected events due to climate change. Also, and lastly, as Sarah mentioned before, when we look at non-white communities, BIPOC communities, they are disproportionately susceptible to the adverse health effects, whether that's because of biological or different physiology, or if it's because of different access and just historic and systemic inequities. We need to take specific focus on how to mitigate those impacts. And if we could just go into the next slide, I'll go into some of these a little bit more. So when we look at the different extremes, I just chose a snippet. There are many more impacts, but those for New Rochelle that are most susceptible, we're looking at this interplay of the different climate impacts and how they all impact the health and well-being of communities. The more vulnerable, the more susceptible. So looking at the physical impacts, emotional and mental health, economic, challenges, and I'm including social capital, because when we in different reports from heat waves, one of the most famous report, and this is a while ago from Chicago, there were many deaths in the senior population because of those who were unable to reach their neighbors or leave their communities. With ongoing in real time, we've seen other social capital be challenged when people are isolated or they cannot reach transportation routes to get away from different like flooding, like that's happened in Vermont, or different heat waves, or looking at dam breaks. So there's a whole like social like impact on social capital from different types of hazards. Just to highlight a couple of different areas, when we look at air quality, New Rochelle, between 2016 and 2018, there was 59.4% of 100,000 ED emergency department visits for asthma. That has increased in the most recent years. And there's other air quality respiratory infections for that people who are more sensitive, who have autoimmune, children again, and seniors are more susceptible to air quality impacts. Looking at the wildfire, increase in wildfire smoke, whether we see it all over the country, but the Northeast and New York and the Hudson Valley has just experienced that. And so that's compounding with already susceptible or already impacted air quality. In New Rochelle, as Norm mentions, the likelihood of increased heat is exponentially going to increase, and increases to 81% over the next 30 years, from 23% 30 years ago. And that change in heat will actually impact all of these health risks and threats. We look at food and water security. It can damage, it can impact the agriculture, the food nutrition, water availability. Heat is often accompanied by droughts, and those with lower access will have a harder time finding nutritious foods. There will be increased food deserts, which we already have seen in COVID, and different areas to supply chain disruptions, and again, those can be compounded with other hazards such as floods or heat, which can impact transportation. Looking at vector-borne diseases, Lyme, as we know, is on the increase. We've seen it in New York City. We see it growing throughout the Northeast. And it's in areas that were unexpected. And so those, again, one of the compounding impacts are people with little access to healthcare will have a harder time getting treatment for, or sustained treatment for any sort of infectious disease or chronic illness. And lastly, looking at food-related diseases, New Rochelle is also, we will see later on, some of the impervious lands that New Rochelle is susceptible to, and which will increase the risk of floods, coastal storms, and increased precipitation. Looking at glacier melt that will further increase the sea level rise. Next slide, please.
Lori, you got 2 more minutes, and then we're gonna have to hand it off to.
Okay, thank you for, I can just go on and on. Thank you.
Yeah, we need time for the next 3 speakers. So
Yep. This is just showing a broader overview, a more global overview of different risks and their impacts on climate, and then their impact on health. It has it siloed out, but the reality is that it's very hard to separate them, and they all compound on each other. And so you have rising temperature. Oh, okay.
This one's still you.
Oh, okay. Can you go to the next slide then? Thanks. So just looking at a visual, I just chose a couple of different variables and indicators in the report, and throughout the project, this will be broken down more, but just looking at a visual, I think helps us see where in New Rochelle the different areas are more variable or are more vulnerable. So looking at the heat map on this left side, and it is overlaid with the heat vulnerability index and demographic. So the more demographically vulnerable communities are also in the areas that are more susceptible to heat change, to heat increases, which also overlays with housing burdens and limited English. When you look at other maps, it shows the same picture, especially with like asthma and different other chronic illnesses. Next slide, please. So one of the most important things I think is looking that the drivers of inequities are also the facilitators of building more equitable health impacts. So looking at these different components, built environment, infrastructure, healthcare access, increased green space, all of these areas can cause inequities, but when you are looking at different mitigation measures and policies and implementation of different programs, such as what New Rochelle is doing here, it can help to reverse those inequities with a specific focus on limiting exposures, taking into consideration sensitivities of specific communities, and increasing adaptive capacity. All right, I think I'm not within the 2 minutes now. Thanks. I included that in that slide. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laurie. We're gonna hand it off to Bernadette now to talk about community resources.
Thanks, Mel. I'm Bernadette Callahan. I'm a water resources engineer with Stantec. And for my section of the report, we're going to look through more of the built environment and apply that same lens that Nels and Norm put together. And as Laurie mentioned, there's a lot of overlap between the risks and as you'll see, the hot spots for New Rochelle. So we're breaking this down into a series of different categories: health and social services, so those that provide education, healthcare, support, and social assistance, like government buildings, community centers; housing assets that really focusing on the affordable housing and publicly owned or subsidized housing within New Rochelle; looking at utilities, so really focusing on the utilities that are critical for New Rochelle to function. So looking at water distribution, storm, energy, gas, telecommunication, waste management, all that have impacts for their proximity to the water. Economic assets, so that's something that we might not think as much about, but really thinking through how are goods and services being transported to and out of New Rochelle. So looking at transportation networks, really understanding the tourist attractions and educational facilities. What is it about New Rochelle that is driving economic well-being for the city? And finally, looking at cultural resources, so really highlighting areas that hold cultural or historic or artistic value. And what we're doing with this is cataloging all of these areas on maps and kind of applying those different climate resiliency frames, meeting with the city, to really get a better understanding of the local data as we apply this lens. So over the next 3 slides, I'm going to take a look at some of the climate risks and give you an understanding, a quick overview of some of the strategies that we're looking at. So the first is looking at sea level rise and coastal storms. So Norm's group has put together some maps for us, really looking at what the potential sea level rise conditions will be and how that projects onto the landscape. I've highlighted a few here to look at, but really New Rochelle has 9 miles of coastal land that's susceptible to sea level rise conditions and storm surges. So what that does is it takes away the landscape. You have property damage from the flooding, erosion of the coastline, which is a big concern because those are the measures that really protect New Rochelle from these large storm surges that we're seeing. Reduced capacity or an inability to drain the storm sewer network. Really that would be from a tailwater condition. So as the water rises, The pipes may be under water and not able to drain, which causes interior flooding as well. And then some concerns may be tied to saltwater intrusion. So this idea of saltwater kind of coming onto freshwater sources and having an impact on water distribution systems. Some of the strategies that we're looking at, and I just highlighted a few, but they'll be outlined in the report, are really looking at reducing development in these flood-prone areas, looking at future conditions as we develop land use strategies and development guidelines, trying to conserve the space that you do have along the water, reduce impervious cover where possible. So those are the hard surfaces like roads, pavement, where water is not able to seep back into the ground, and increase green space. Protection measures may be more soft and hard systems. So coastal protection measures could be seawalls, levees, but they could also be living shorelines where you're protecting the barrier islands, using living natural systems to really protect those waterways. Implementing waterproofing measures, so really looking at buildings that can't be relocated or have waterproofing issues, and building some type of waterproofing measures around them. It may be raising critical infrastructure within those flood zones, or updating the utilities to withstand that future water level rise. Next slide. Okay, looking at the changes in precipitation patterns. So this map on the right is really one way of modeling future water issues, both interior and along the coastline. So as we know, we have sea level rise concerns along the waterway, but there's also interior drainage network issues that may arise from these changes in precipitation patterns. So this is both swings. So we have extended periods of drought where we may not have water at all. And in those cases, we really want to look at managing water right where it falls and getting it back into the ground to really replenish those groundwater sources, reduce stormwater runoff. And then we're also seeing what we're calling cloudburst events, which are high intensity. So it means a lot of water is happening in a short duration. So this is a trend of climate change where we're seeing these really big storm events that are dumping a lot of water, sometimes in a matter of minutes or hours, that maybe would have happened over days in the past. And in those cases, we really need to look at building extra resiliency into our system, whether it's building extra buffers around these open channels that are throughout New Rochelle, really looking into the maintenance and making sure that those have the storage that they need during these storm events. Again, reducing impervious cover. So wherever we can, try to get the water back into the ground so that it's not flowing down into these areas that are a little bit low lying. And really promoting this idea of low impact development strategies and practices. Keeping water local, finding ways to get it back into the ground right where it falls. Other big protection measures might be looking at reservoirs, infiltration-based practices, trying to get the water back into the ground, looking at evacuation routes and making sure that we have safe access in and out of New Rochelle, and then addressing additional capacity as needed. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to address extended heat waves. So the maps on the right, they're kind of interesting because they're inverses of one another. The one on the left is a surface land temperature that was presented earlier. Really looking at like the orange and red areas would be the hot areas. And if you can kind of look at the tree coverage and impervious surfaces, again, those are roadways or buildings, places where water is not able to get back into the ground, you can really start to see the direct correlation between tree cover, hard surfaces, and where we're seeing these hot heat island effects. In these areas, we really want to look at reducing that impervious cover. So taking away pavement, adding green space and vegetation, adding trees, really looking at that urban tree canopy. So for the downtown areas, that may be as simple as planting trees along the roadway. For protection measures, we are looking into options to build into future resiliency codes, such as retrofitting homes for improved efficiency. Again, thinking of this idea of emergency shelters and community places where residents can go when we have these heat waves, and looking for green building codes and standards. I think I'm going to pass it off for more of the natural resources now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. So now we have Adam from our team who's going to talk about New Rochelle's natural resources. Is Adam here?
There we go. I thought I needed to be unmuted. I'm sorry. Afternoon or evening. Adam Nowicki. I'm an environmental scientist with Stantec. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk. Norm and Bernadette covered one of the biggest risks that we're looking at. Things that are going on here with water bodies, flooding. You're looking at areas of fluvial flooding and also coastal flood risks. These are fluvial areas are areas that are along your streams, flowing water bodies. What happens is that water, you don't just get flood from the waters that fall in New Rochelle. You'll get flooding from any rain that falls upstream as well. So the further downstream you get, the more water is compounded into that small stream channel. And these high intensity, short duration precipitation events will exacerbate the problem, because you're dumping a lot of water into a small area and giving it only a small channel to escape from. And then especially in the coast, you have a compounding problem where you have your storm surge pushing up against the waters that are coming downstream. So you have upstream water and downstream water meeting in those where those tidal water bodies are trying to exit into the ocean and get rid of those floodwaters. So we can go to the next slide. One of the this has been discussed again, is these open spaces and non-impervious surfaces, green spaces that you have. Bernadette's slide, a couple of slides back, showed you where you've got tree cover and open space, and this is kind of dialing in on those parks and green areas that are located in New Rochelle. You can see you've got a number of open spaces up in the north, where the golf course and the reservoir and Ward Acres are, and then along your coastline. But as Bernadette pointed out, that central area, you've got a lot of built up impervious surface, and that can help, or not help, but that can lead to increased risk of flooding. The water needs to go somewhere. It doesn't get to percolate down into the ground, and that leads to issues with your waters run high and they run low. As Norm mentioned earlier, we're looking at not just these frequent high intensity storms, but you're also looking at longer, hotter, drier drought periods. So your aquifers and your reservoirs get depleted as as there isn't water coming in. They dry out, they get used, and they don't get replenished as easily, because the water, when you do get precipitation, it comes so hard and so fast that most of it flows out into the ocean, and it doesn't get captured into these freshwater usage. So this is where your open space becomes even more critical in being able to trap water and keep water available. So next slide. Yes, thank you. The last thing we're looking at here is the natural communities. As you can see, the shoreline is home to several significant natural communities, statewide, bird assemblages, and areas where threatened, endangered shorebirds primarily can be found. So rising sea levels are going to be an issue as far as these communities are concerned. Depending on what type of habitat that they utilize, it may disappear, it may move, it may move inland. That's something that we'll have to be looking at. And then it's hard to see, but we have small areas where there are mapped invasive species. It's those little dark dots. And those are plants, invasive plants that we have that have been mapped within the city boundaries. And those areas are expected to increase, which will be harmful for native plants, native animals that utilize specific habitats that you might have. They're hard to eradicate, and they spread more easily, and they're anticipated to spread more easily as the climate warms, and they're typically more easily adaptable to new areas or to changes in the environment.
Adam, I'm gonna have to cut you off there. We have just got a couple minutes left for Astrid to talk about resilient hubs, and then we're gonna move to Q&A. Astrid is there. You have 4 minutes. So while Astrid is getting booted up, assuming that she is able to, I can go ahead and start talking about this. So one of the things that we're going to be doing as a part of this work is to identify places in the community that are physical spaces that can help for preparedness for climate change. And so they will offer the opportunity for social cohesion. Yeah, Astrid's on, but we can't hear her. So, and they have a lot of potential attributes. For example, community gardens, information boards, solar power, recreation spaces. And so one of the things that Astrid is doing will be looking at the existing community organizations and facilities in New Rochelle and identifying candidates for becoming resilient hubs.
Can you hear me now? Is it better? Oh, I'm so sorry. Don't know.
Wrap up the last slide here, and then we're gonna move on.
Yeah, sorry. What happened with technical? Yeah, I think what Nels mentioned, it's all on point. The resilience hubs are not meant just to be thought of in times of crises or emergencies, but they're meant to be for everyday resilience. They are physical buildings in the community. The key components are kind of like the overarching consideration, key elements that these sites have to have. So communications, it's really important, especially not just during recovery periods of disruption, but also on an everyday year-round service. Power systems also has been mentioned during the event of energy loss. We need to have other storage for energy. We need to have solar panels. We need to have other backup power systems to be able to provide services to the community during emergencies. Operations are centered around not just the able to respond to these emergencies, but also maybe these are places that are trusted within the community year round. There's people that other smaller neighborhoods already trust in, and they're more willing to go there and when they need to. And the services and programs are also, again, thought about this whole everyday resilience. So it could be something about a community center, a senior center, it could be a church, it could be a school. All these things require people and require services and programming to activate these locations so that they are places that the community, again, already trusts when things are happening. The considerations are more centered around, if we have these buildings in our community, what do we need to have in those buildings to bring them up to speed to be resilience hubs? Adaptability, they need to be flexible, the community involvement, people need to trust so they can go there. Human centered, again, this is about human and community resilience, not just climate resilience. The location, I think it has been covered that it needs to be accessible and needs to be a place that people can go to in case of emergency, that there's public transportation and accessibility for people with disabilities. And the resilient solutions, I think it's an opportunity to bring all these buildings up to a higher standard so that they are able to respond when process shocks and all these emergencies are happening. I think one of the key things that I want to close with is for the community to start thinking about what are trusted locations in your neighborhood. And if you think about where would you go if you had to leave your house in the event of an emergency, because that's the next step for us to think about where these buildings can be. But we cannot propose that. The community has to tell us what are the places that they already trust and they can go to. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Astrid. So we've already had a little bit of community input. These are some results from the survey that is out there right now. And so it asks questions like, what types of climate mitigation you might think about yourself, and what issues you're currently facing, especially in terms of climate resilience. So write down that URL. There'll be links provided to it. We want a number of people to continue filling out the survey. And with that, we are now moving into Q&A. So with Q&A, we're taking questions, written questions in the chat. We have a number already, and I welcome you to write in, and we'll direct the question to the most pertinent expert on our panel. And so I'm going to just start with some of the ones that have already been typed in and hand them off. So the first one, or one of the ones that we've received, was how does the interior precipitation pattern map match with the recent city flood mapping project? And one of the notes here is that we are meeting with the DPW very soon, even tomorrow. And when that report is completed, it will be integrated into this vulnerability assessment as well. But I don't know if Bernadette, you want to mention anything more about the interior wetness map?
Yeah, so we are planning to meet with DPW tomorrow, and we have had several discussions already where we've mapped some of the flood calls that were done during Ida that was shown on the map. We're also looking at flood predictor type applications where we're looking at upstream drainage area and the slope of the land to really better understand where we have high risk areas. So that, in addition to the feedback that we're getting from these real-time calls, is really going to help us narrow in on some of the higher vulnerable areas.
Great, thank you, Bernadette. Another question that has come in, this was regarding Adam's presentation on open space. The question was, by open space, does that mean open space or space with trees / foliage? So Adam, maybe you want to respond. I think I can easily flip back up to that map of public space or open spaces here.
Yeah, so the open spaces that are shown on this map, these are your parks and other large open areas. There's parks, there's trails. So that's what we're looking at as open space. Now, of course, adding trees, adding other pervious vegetated areas is always a good thing. But in particular, that's what we're looking at.
Great. And then a somewhat related question, since we're here, during your presentation, we had a question. Several of our parks have been refitted with artificial surfaces. Is there a plan to restore the natural parkland? And Bernadette, you can also weigh in on this.
Yeah, we noticed that as well during our site walk with the city. I think for these sports fields, there typically is a subsurface drainage system so that it functions as if it's natural land, allowing the water to infiltrate back into the ground. So those systems are providing a stormwater management benefit. I'll kick it back to you, Nels, if you want to let anybody else weigh in.
You're the green infrastructure expert on the on the team. So yeah, I guess the answer is, if appropriately designed, they're not harmful, and there is a place for them for the benefits that they provide. But that doesn't diminish the need, especially in some parts of the city that we've explored, for more tree canopy and coverage. So that was it for questions that we've received through chat. If there are others, please get them in. We'll give you a couple minutes, and then we're going to go over to polling and close out by the city staff. So we'll just give folks a couple more minutes to write in anything.
Hi, Nels. It's Carol Samuel here. I wanted to actually engage Paul Presideau to see if he had any questions. I hope he's still there. Yes, there he is. He's still there. He is our NRAC chair. He's coming on. There we go.
I didn't know
Not to put you on the spot, Paul, but I thought let's engage you.
Yeah, what I would say is that this is all, it's very legendary work. That's all I could say, because it is allowing us to kind of go into like I guess, access the historical catacombs of what's happening in New Rochelle. And while we're having this like forward-thinking strategy of climate resilience all together, just really knowing what are going to be the trends for our most vulnerable communities. It's really important work in terms of flood mitigation and I guess overall resilience, looking at urban heat island effects and things that shows that, you know, we have certain sections of New Rochelle that are disproportionately being impacted by climate change as opposed to other locations. And I guess the one question I would have is, because you know, here with NRAC, I know we have a couple of people that are here, is how do we get more information on this? Is this the only presentation that will be done? Is there going to be another one that's going to be done in the future? An in-person presentation, if there's a budget line for the Department of Development for some milk and cookies, I don't know. But is there any other opportunities for us to, I guess, gain this information again, in terms of just being aware of what's going to be done and what the impacts are through the lens of citizen science if we don't take action as a city?
I'll just jump in. When we get towards the wrap up, I'll talk about some other ways to keep the conversation moving going forward over the next few months. So I appreciate that. And Carol, thank you for recognizing Paul as our chair for Ecology and Natural Resource Advisory Committee. And we do have a couple other members that have joined the call. I believe Ryan Alejandro, I believe I hope I didn't miss anyone else. So I want to recognize those folks and thank them for joining this evening. So sit tight. I know we have a couple more questions coming in, and we'll provide a couple more we'll provide some more information in a couple minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for joining in, Paul. That was really nice to hear. Yeah, we will, in addition to some additional events like this one and pop-up events in the community, of course, the results will be delivered in a report format prepared by the folks that are on this call today. And we expect that will be really helpful for helping to understand the vulnerability in New Rochelle. So we had 2 more questions rolled in the chat. Thank you for those. So the first one is there any thought to having our electric wire underground? And I will also hand this one off to Bernadette as a civil engineer.
I guess the benefit would be during these large storm events with high winds, there's a lower chance of electricity going out. That would be a big undertaking and something to consider.
Yeah, at least what I've heard previously is that every pole that you want to put down is at least $1 million underground because of all the wires that have to be moved and the different companies that have to work with that. So it definitely comes with a big price tag, but there are benefits. And another question, is there any benefits to opening the rivers to daylight? So we assume that this means daylighting rivers that have been covered maybe through a culvert or developed on top of. And I can hand this one off to Adam.
Yeah, so there's definite benefit to doing that. It provides allows it to spread out, allows it to capture water more easily, and it's a better environmental benefit. The problem is you're looking at a significant amount of space. I'm sure Bernadette can also chime in on this as far as how much you're talking about as if you try to convert a river that's been converted to being underground to something that's being out in the open.
Yeah, some of the considerations for New Rochelle would be really looking at the steep slopes and making sure that we have a nice conveyance path, one that went in the road and one that allows for overland flooding without impacting residents. I think it's a great idea. I think that's something I'll take note of and look into for the report.
Okay. Oh. I was about to call it, but we had one last question slip in. Are heat pumps with green roofs being installed for public buildings? And maybe someone from the city can tackle that one. I'm not sure of any existing programs in New Rochelle.
Currently, no, but we've been having a number of different conversations and continue to explore possibilities for sure.
I think one thing to note on that is green roofs can be really challenging to retrofit onto existing buildings. So that might be a recommendation to look at for future construction, just due to the weight of the structure itself when you have saturated soils up there.
Right. So we have another question. When can we start to see a final report on the floodwater runoff study, whether inclusive of tonight's presentation or not? And when will infrastructure improvements reflecting those needed, those issues be built? So that is a parallel project being run, and I'm not sure when the results will be made public if someone in the city has an idea.
Carol may have more information than I do. That study is being done in the Department of Public Works. Separate entity, but of course we have constant contact with them, and as mentioned earlier, we're having a discussion with them tomorrow, so I may have some more information then. And we're sharing a lot of information for ways to reach out to us, so feel free to reach out to us through our generic GreenNR email address that we have, or anyone can always contact me directly by phone or email. So I think tomorrow we'll have some more information, but what they're doing now is kind of just the analysis, kind of the first step background. for the city. And then once that's done, they're gonna have to go to the next step for like a plan for the projects to make those improvements. So it's a lot of work. I mean, it really is a lot of work that's being undertaken. But in terms of, the actual infrastructure improvements that result from what they're doing now, the analysis, it's gonna be a little while.
And I would just add that the city is already actively working to raise the funds necessary, because it will be quite significant, the need. We're already actively doing that.
Great. Thank you for chiming in. So Public Works Partners will just have to let us know when we're moving away from Q&A and to wrap up, but as long as these, okay, this this is the last question. So thank you to everyone who has written in. The very last question that we have received is, are there any initiatives or incentives in the city regarding low or no emission vehicles or transportation, public and or private?
Sure, I'll take that. There's a number of different things we have going on. I mean, from within our own fleet, within the city, we have a number of EV vehicles and facilities to charge them. And we're actually currently kicking off an EV study right now for citywide analysis for future projects and expansion of that. We're encouraging electric vehicles and the private development that's happening on private property throughout the city. But one of the other things that we're fairly proud of is a shuttle that we have. It's called Circuit NR, and it's available for a certain portion of the city for free to anyone in the public. And it's it's an electric shuttle. It's a 6-person shuttle that's free. It's available through an app, and it's been a huge success in terms of getting people around the city cheap, affordably. Obviously, it's free, but also just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's the number of trips that have been taken through the Circuit service is really substantial. So it's a fantastic service, and it's something that we're proud of. But we're also looking for other opportunities as well, and other ways to support mass transit.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So that concludes Q&A. So it's been Stantec's real pleasure and honor to present today. Hopefully you learned some things about climate vulnerability in New Rochelle. And with that, I think we're handing it back to the city or Public Works Partners to close us out with the next steps.
Yeah, I think that's me. So we do have some information online on the city's website. There's the link here you see is the tiny URL link, but it's really a city website. So you can go through this tiny URL link, or you can go to the city's website at newrochelleny.com and get to the sustainability page to find out more information about the project, and other ways to reach us. And then next slide. Also on that page and elsewhere is the survey. So we saw earlier with our poll at the beginning of this session that a number of people have taken the survey. If you haven't already, please take a moment to do it. It takes just a few minutes to complete. And we'd also ask, if you can, share it with others. So we're really trying to, the survey is going to be out for a while. We're actually going to have it up. It's been out for a few weeks, and we're going to have it out into September. So there's time, but do it now if you can. Don't wait, because we don't want you to forget about it. So we're really getting some great information with the results so far with the survey. So we encourage you to access it and submit your results and share it with others. And next slide. So early on, we started out with a poll, and we're going to do one last one before we close out for the evening. So get ready. Let's see what we have here. How would you like to, well, turn off the lights on me here. How would you like to be involved in Climate Ready NR? I'm going to let you guys fill it out, and I'm going to go put the lights on. Be right back.
Dark.
All right, I'm back with light. Let's see, I got it's 100% have answered. So, the majority of people here have said, I want to work more closely with the city on achieving it. That's fantastic. I mean, we greatly appreciate that. There's some folks who want to take action on their own. I can appreciate that. And then there are a number of people who said, I want to help spread the word about actions, my friends. That's fantastic. I greatly appreciate that. This has been very helpful. I think these polls, I think, are kind of a fun way to engage with everyone, but they're not just about having fun, they're actually informative and helpful for us. So I appreciate everyone sharing that information. So next slide, and I think we'll close out. So as I said, the survey is going to be out through September, and we have a number of different events that we're going to have a presence at coming up. You should come to those events because you can talk to us about this project, and we're going to be there. We're going to have some information for you. We're going to be engaging, getting your comments and feedback and information. But in particular, before we know it, on the 22nd is Taste of Union. If you're not coming to talk to us, you should definitely be coming for the event because it's awesome. If you weren't there last year, it was a huge success, and it's going to be even better this year. Tons of great food and just music, and just a great time to get together with the community. And then in September, the annual street fair that we have, which is also an amazing event. We're going to be there as well for that. So those are two great events to come out, whether you're coming to chat with us about climate change, or if you want to just not talk about such serious topics and just have a good time with the community, come for that. And then we are going to have another session similar to this, another virtual session on September 20th. So mark your calendars and stay tuned. And we hope you can join us again that evening for some more information and some more dialogue. And again, I just ask, if possible, if you can spread the word to your network so people are aware of all these events. And with that, I want to thank you all. I want to thank my colleagues. I want to thank our elected officials that joined us. I want to thank the members from NREC that were here. And most importantly, I want to thank all the residents who took time this evening to join us. So thank you all. Please feel free to follow up with us for more information, and have a good evening.